Hi, I'm Allyson Gavaletz. I'm a bookseller with Barnes & Noble, and today I'm talking to Emma Knight, the author of our January book club, The Life Cycle of the Common Octopus. I'm so excited to talk to you today, Emma. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm thrilled to be here, Allyson.
Well, I have to tell you, I'm actually at my friend's house in London right now. And my friend that I'm staying with went to St. Andrews. So as I was rereading a couple things going this, I kept banging to her being like, is this true? Is this what you guys are like? Is this true?
What did your friend say?
She said, well, it is a small city and everybody does know everybody, but I don't think we were like that.
I'm a little hard on St. Andrews. That much is true. A small amount of gentle rivalry between the University of Edinburgh and St. Andrews is responsible for some of those quips. But no, I have a lot of close friends who went to St. Andrews as well, and it is an incredible place.
Yeah. And because you went to University of Edinburgh.
I did.
So that part's a little lifelike in the book.
That part is a little bit, yes, I definitely borrowed settings from my memory.
Yeah. From page 1, you delve into motherhood. And you have 2 young children. I believe you were pregnant with your second one when you wrote this. And so were some of your thoughts coming out of the page while you were writing it?
Absolutely. Motherhood is a kind of metamorphosis. And I think the fact that I was going through that transformation while writing this book certainly informed the way I wrote about the other transformation that the main characters are going through. So the book is about 18-year-olds who are kind of have one foot in childhood and one foot in adulthood. It's told from the perspective of an older narrator who has just become a mother. And there's some dramatic irony there because I think as you get older, your perspective widens and the sense of being a fully independent and highly autonomous adult that I know I had at 18 is not how I, in my 30s, look at an 18-year-old or look at my infant child and project into their future. You know, at age 18, am I going to consider you a fully formed adult? No, I am not. And I was interested in this concept of life cycles and of, there's the age of maturity, but maturity comes in so many different forms. So there's the sort of physical maturity that takes place at that age, but emotional maturity and kind of spiritual and intellectual maturity can come later. And so I would say that this is the quest in the book that Pen, our protagonist, is starting to individuate from her family of origin, and she's starting the long process of developing that sort of intellectual and emotional maturity that I think we all as humans hope to acquire on our journey on this planet.
So Pen walks into a family at one point that is so welcoming and fun and kind, and they take to each other instantly. And it seems like it almost fills a void for her as an only child. Do you think that's something she always wanted?
I do think that there's a sense of belonging as an only child and an only child of parents who no longer are able to find love for one another. I think she does miss feeling a part of a tribe. That's something that built-in community, that belonging to something feeling she finds both with her friends at the University of Edinburgh and with the Lennoxes. You're absolutely right. And the friendly jibing that is part of that family life and the kind of, I can make fun of you and it comes from a place of love. All of that has been missing for her. And I think she really takes to all of that.
And it seems like she has it too, like you said, with her friends, but with Alice, of course, they've grown up so close together. And then also it seems like a little bit with Alice's mother too, like that her mom seems to kind of mother Pen a little bit, which is really sweet.
Yeah. I think if you're lucky to have a close friend like that from childhood, then their parents are important, can be very important figures in your life and almost like a second set of parents. And even now, as kids come over for play dates here, I find myself, thinking of them as that's just sort of a natural thing that happens. And I think it's very beautiful.
Yeah, I think so too. I love that Pen reaches out to Lord Lennox because it's almost a very unhinged thing to do. And as we get to know Pen more, it's a bit uncharacteristic of her. She reaches out to him, and then she actually goes to meet him and stays for more than one night. Can you talk about just that audacity?
Yeah. So I think there's a very different Pen somewhere inside Pen. I think we all contain multitudes, but I think this young woman at 18 has been living in a certain way as a result of her upbringing and her environment, but that there is a bolder version of her, and this is who Alice, I think, knows and appreciates. And with Alice, Pen is that version of herself. There is a point in the novel where Alice, when we're in Alice's point of view, and she comments on, the bold side of Pen that she, I think it's when Pen and Fergus are having a little bit of a conversation outside of the library, and Alice really appreciates and brings out Pen's bold side. And I think in this novel, that's part of what she's getting in touch with. She's trying to shake off the fear of ruffling feathers and this sort of docility that has been bred into her, essentially. I think it's fair to say that, given that it's really her paternal grandmother who's setting this tone and, strongly encouraging a certain type of behavior. And her mother, having had her own struggles, coming from a very different social class background, she's not able to give Pen the tools to kind of be this brave person out in the universe. And that's part of what Pen is trying to find by moving away.
I think that by moving away, I think there's also a time when, like, we're all in our early 20s or whatever, late teens, whatever age it is that we get to be more independent, that we kind of go bold, and you don't have enough context to be afraid almost. So you're like, why not? And that's when you make crazy life choices, good or bad, or you move places or you travel all over. And this seems like to fall under that too.
It definitely does. And I think there is an element of it that has to do with the fact that this is pre-smartphones too. Like,
Yes.
you can only be so free now because you're always tethered to where you came from. Whereas in this context, it's set in 2006. So there were phones, there were Blackberries. The characters don't have them, but there was no iPhone. The iPhone came out in 2007. So these characters have flip phones or brick phones, and they can get in touch with each other and send limited SMS messages with very, very grainy photos. But that's the extent of their pocket connectivity. And, there's iMessage and there are various laptop chat apps that did exist, but, you are not, now your whole past comes with you via FaceTime everywhere you go. And back then you could reinvent yourself on a different level because you had a lot more, I think there was a much stronger boundary between, geographical boundary and a kind of time-space boundary that with contemporary technology is just no longer available to young people.
It was easier to have so many secrets, I think. Like, she didn't tell, like, her dad didn't know that this was happening. Her dad was his friend, and like, she got to just go do this secret thing without him knowing. Could you imagine?
Yeah. Well, I remember the feeling of being, I did not, of course, there was no Lord Lennox in my early adulthood, but I do strongly remember this feeling of, like, I could be anywhere. Nobody is, when I was between 18 and 25, let's say, I was living in different places all the time and I was really appreciating my freedom. And I just remember this feeling of, like, for days at a time, I'm completely unaccounted for. My parents trust me and I don't have a partner and my friends check in, but, I could go, I could go off into somebody's country house and fall down the rabbit hole and nobody needs know. And, like, I think that type of freedom is very heady. And that is something that Pen is experiencing. And the loneliness that can come with that is sort of the flip side of it. But I have strong feelings on the importance of young people experiencing loneliness. Because I think if you avoid loneliness, well, boredom for sure, but also loneliness. And if by always texting and by always being in contact with your people, you don't ever have that feeling of, like, wow, nobody's, it's very healthy to know that feeling early and to know that you can face that early in life.
Yeah, without the distraction of whatever scrolling you're doing, that you can just totally reset your mind to that and not have to deal with it.
Yeah.
While at the Lennox's house, Pen observes Christina and Elliot's relationship as, quote, if not transformative and enduring love, then at least it was a functioning partnership, which is not nothing. And for people who don't have an example of this in their life, that's a mind-blowing thing to observe, that it is possible. And that was so cool for Penn to experience that. And then especially during that formative time, and that kind of led her down the way. And did you have an example of that? Did you want her to have an example of that specifically?
I think the gap between love as we read about it, see it in movies, experience it in culture, and love as we know it as human beings growing up in a world where we know that the divorce rate is over 50%, et cetera, is interesting to me because, Penn is somebody who loves 19th century novels. She loves Jane Austen. She loves, these books in which, like, even Jane Eyre is mentioned several times throughout, and as messy as it gets, Little Janet and Rochester are, it is enduring and it is transformative. And those were some of her kind of literary influences, and becoming wise to that as, she almost views it as a hoax in her early teenage years, when she's 15 and reading these novels and looking at the difference between that and what's happening with her parents who can't even really find civility anymore. It's one of those moments for her where it kind of exposed, like, the jig is up, and those moments that you have when you're growing up and you realize, like, there are no adults. This is all just people doing their best, and their best is not always, Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet, and it's, and I think that, so she, in meeting Lord Lennox and Christina and seeing, she doesn't have that in her own parents, she doesn't have that in Alice's parents. I did want her to see that. I wanted this character to be able to open her mind to the possibility of love as something to aim for. I think it is. As a human being, I'm a complete romantic, and I do believe that love can be both enduring and transformative. And so I did want my kind of cynical young protagonist to at least allow for that possibility in her own life, if not live it in a happily ever after type of way.
It's nice to have those relationships around you, to have those examples of both kinds. It's nice to just see all the different kinds of relationships out there.
Yeah, and the compromises that it takes, right? That it's not a fairy tale, that the more she gets to know them, the more she realizes how much negotiating, how much compromising, how much frustration is built into a functioning marriage. And, that's real life.
Totally. Because she gets there and she walks up to this castle with this famous author and his well-known sister, and like, she kind of has this fantasy. And so you're right, where she gets to actually see that they are humans and they're not just some fairy tale that are in the tabloids and in the papers and all that stuff. So it is cool to realize that people are just people.
Yep, just people doing their best.
Exactly. As we continue to learn about the Lennoxes, we see insight into Christina's world of being a mom, and it is very telling of the kind of person she is. Very different from Penn's mom. She's so in tune with her children, and she, quote, holds herself accountable for every irresponsible thing her sons did, and she finds it exhausting. It must be what being a mother is like. I am not, so I'm assuming.
I mean, I have two daughters, and they're still young, so I think I know nothing yet. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think there's one of the themes that I wanted to explore in this novel, is how many different shapes motherhood can take, and that there are as many different ways of being a mother as there are of being a human being. There's no one ideal that we all need to hold ourselves to, that myth is dangerous, and that, in fact, in the same way as, there are huge differences between the professional aspirations of each of the characters. There will be huge differences in their approach to motherhood, or not becoming mothers, or being aunts, or being, godmothers or stepmothers. Like, it's just not, I think we tend to view it in more of a one size fits all way, even now, than is practical. And now that I'm in the position of motherhood and also working and, all the things, I'm noticing that one of the biggest gifts that being in this time and place has offered me is choice. That my grandmother's generation and my mother's generation we're held to a very different and much more limited kind of, I'd say, view of what's acceptable in motherhood, and that we have the privilege of getting to kind of rewrite the narrative. And in exploring the mothers in that generation in the novel, so there's Christina, there's Penn's mother, there's Alice's mother, you know, there's even Margot. I wanted to show that you can successfully mother in so many different ways, and that it's the torturing ourselves part that that causes a lot of problems down the generational line, you know, and that progress is, I think, in the direction of greater flexibility and kind of honoring our differences, not continuing to self-flagellate for our perceived missteps or, I guess, inability to conform.
It's so interesting because you also, like, you were talking about all the different kinds of mothers there are, and there's a lot of different examples in this book, but there's also different kids. I mean, like, you have two children, and Christina and Lord Lennox have two children, and, you know, there's so many different kids, and all of the siblings are so different. So it's also like being a mother must be so interesting because what works for one doesn't work for the other, and everybody's just trying to do their best. And I always find that to be so fascinating too.
It really is fascinating, and it's absolutely true. I think parents sometimes think like, oh, I'm going to apply all my lessons from child number 1 to child number 2. And then child number 2 comes and they're like, what the? And that's, yeah, it's humbling.
Yeah. I loved the part of Penn talking about the mating rituals of students in the first decade of the 21st century being embarrassing, about how people used to hop around to a trashy song and how they all had cheered the second time the song came on in the space of just a few hours. Recognizing the tune made them feel like they were doing the right thing. This is around the time that I was in college as well, and leaving college, and this was absolutely my experience in my early 20s in New York City. And this is going to make me sound so old what I'm about to say, but I don't know if kids these days go out in the same way.
It was
But I'm
so
so
much
glad I
fun.
had that. It was so fun, and I'm so glad to have a shared experience with you and these characters because it was just such a reflecting moment to be like, oh man, and the friend I'm staying with, she and I would go out in that way too. And it was so fun to think about the characters doing that.
It is such a good release. Dancing with friends, almost especially when you're bad at dancing and you don't care. Like,
Yeah.
just I'm making a playlist right now to go with the
Uh-huh.
novel. And so I've been listening to, and I've even got like and now we're going clubbing section.
Amazing.
And it's really just like the best possible feeling. Music contains so much memory. And I think like it unleashes memory, and it kind of, it connects to our past in a way that, like, smell and, you know,
Yeah.
I find we're just so lucky to have, I mean, speaking of technology, the ability to call up those songs and to kind of tap into those feelings and that freedom in that way.
I mean, I still have a lot of my CDs, I have to say. And
Amazing.
I have a car with a CD player, and sometimes I'll just grab one and put it on, and it's like it is the craziest throwback because none of those CDs are new. So it is the craziest throwback to be in the car and be like, "Oh, I remember driving here with this song on," and it makes you wanna call that person, it makes you wanna,
Right.
like, tell the story of what you were doing. It is so nostalgic.
What CD are we talking about here?
That's such a good question. What is well, Garth Brooks, Dixie Chicks. I'm from Colorado, so it's a lot of country,
Amazing.
90s country music.
That's awesome.
Yeah, a little embarrassing, but I stand by it. I love it.
No, yeah, I mean, I'm rediscovering the Strokes right now, and I'm like, yeah,
Oh,
yeah, that's a vibe.
totally. We threw my mom a party, the 70s party, and we were listening to all those songs, which is more of what I grew up with. And so it was fun to be there and be like, oh, this song. I love that. Thank you for putting that in the book. It was really wonderful.
Thank you for noticing it.
Alice and Penn are such good friends, but both experiencing, we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but they're both experiencing something that they don't share with each other. And I think that's part of growing up and finding your own identity at that age. And I loved their friendship because of that, because it was so real in that way. Can you speak to that? Did you experience that?
Yeah, so I can speak to having a very close friend who was very different for me and remains very different for me, and how we saw a risk of, we did see a risk, I think, of failing to be our fullest selves by relying too much on each other. And I think what we were talking about before with loneliness, even, if you're French, if when two people sort of grow into each other, instead of giving each other room to grow in their own unique, possibly freaky way, then they can limit each other. And I think friendship is the most beautiful thing in the world, and it can become codependent. It can become, it can slow you down if you're not. I think if you're not and sometimes friendships end too early because people fail to kind of make the allowances necessary to let the other person grow. And so I think these two characters, for various reasons, recognize how lucky they are, especially over the course of the novel. They get a sense of how lucky they are to have each other in their lives. And they do withhold certain aspects of their lives from one another. Yeah, as you say, like, it's part of their development. They know that if the other judges what they're doing, then they'll judge themselves through the other person's eyes. They've known each other long enough that that's a risk, and they're not ready for that. And it's not all as thought through as that. They're sort of acting on instinct. But yeah, I do have experience of making a conscious effort with a close friend, mutually, by mutual agreement, to give each other space to mess up. And I think that's healthy.
It's also, at that age too, it's also so easy to kind of have the independent growth and then harbor ill will towards each other for that. Like, oh, they've changed so much, because it's you still have to be able to come back together and connect on that too. And that's, I think, the sign of a true friendship, is when you do get to go do your own experiences and then be like, that's so cool that you did that, and tell me about it, or I'm so sorry you went through that, or whatever it is. But like, that's the like perfection.
Well, yeah. And I think, we were talking about love a minute ago and marriage. And I think it's funny how one of the things I was doing with this book was exploring how friendship doesn't always, and there are a lot of books that are doing this these days, and I absolutely love that like friendship can be centered in the same way that romantic love is centered. Because if you think about the sweep of somebody's life, if you think about somebody who who's lived a long and happy life, are their friendships as important as their romantic involvement? And in some cases, are the friendships much longer lasting? And that, to me, was something I wanted to explore, because we tend to kind of treat the friendships as secondary, and to really hone in on the romance part. But very often the friendships are actually what sustain us for far longer. And in the most difficult moments of our lives, it's often our friends we turn to. So I wanted to show how, you said earlier, like, oh, you can think of a friend, oh, that person has changed, or you've changed, I no longer recognize you. Of course they change. We all change over the course of our life. And that's true in a marriage too, that if you don't allow for your partner to change, then it probably won't endure, because surely we all want each other to evolve. And I guess, yeah, one of the themes of individuation and of discovering this kind of independent, autonomous spirit in each of us, that requires allowances from the people closest to us. And it requires a kind of empathy and compassion from others in our orbit. And you have to know how to ask for that, which is something that Penn sort of learns from her parents.
Yeah, that's very true. I have to go back to something that you just said, because my friends and I were all together for a long weekend a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about this. All of us are single, and we've been friends since college, so for over 20 years. And we were talking about how there's an article I read a while ago that was talking about people finding love later in life, and how their friends may be more important, and their friends may come before their romantic partner, because they've had those people in their lives for so long. And how hard is it to find? Sometimes it can be very hard to find a romantic relationship, because you're like, you're not ever going to be as important to me. You may be very important. It's not to say I don't take you seriously, I don't find you important, but there's going to be these group of people who are just a little bit more important than you. And I find that to be probably very true, and also fascinating. That's something that people don't talk about very much, because our society is so built around romantic love instead of friendship.
Yeah. And isn't it interesting how monogamy is so built into our picture of romantic love, but it's not a factor in friendship, and how much more complicated that makes friendship, and therefore how
Right.
much more interesting narratively. um, not that monogamy is the only rule these days, but it still is sort of an expectation for most, that I can safely say, in most cases with a romantic relationship. But friendship is meant to be uh, broader than that. And yeah, exactly. And so I think that when Penn and Alice go to university and widen their circle, and the push and pull of that, and to your point about romantic relationships, and there's a scene that I ended up cutting toward the end where Alice meets Sasha for the first time. She's pretty,
Oh,
and even you can sense in some of their conversation when Penn is starting to have feelings for Sasha that Alice is not so open to the idea of this guy. And, that obviously is something that happens in real life, that our friends can be slow to warm sometimes to the people we're attracted to, for better and worse. And that was also something I wanted to explore.
oh, that's cool. I would love to read that deleted chapter sometime. When Penn goes home for the holidays, she and her mother have a really lovely chat in a way that they never have before, and they really dig into some things. And it exposes the maturing mother-daughter relationship that some people get to have after they leave school. And it's really lovely. And there's not really a question, but it's more of just like, I'm really glad that you chose to have those characters do that, because there was such a push and pull with her parents in the book. And it's nice to see, as she is experiencing all of these other lovely relationships, it's nice that she and her mom get to have that moment too.
Yeah, I mean, that was not premeditated. That just sort of came. Like, I did not plan, now Penn will go home for the holidays and have a heart to heart with her mother. It was more just that in writing her strange feeling of homesickness at home, that very bizarre feeling of, I've been living away from this place and it's no longer my home in the way it used to be. But it reminds me, I think I made some reference to, she in her childhood bedroom can like picture her 16-year-old self eating Oreos on the bed with Alice, and that sort of like Borges feeling of the splitting of selves and of like encountering a past self. So she, in re-entering this home that was not her childhood home, that didn't necessarily feel totally like home because it was sort of the post-divorce quickly established home of just her and her mother and their dog. But in going back there, this emotional Pandora's box kind of explodes open, and she just sort of sinks into her mother's love. Like, she can feel it. She hasn't been feeling that, and she feels it when she walks in the door. And it just kind of strips off all the protection that she's been so carefully wearing this whole time. And she just starts talking. And it doesn't go so well, and then they sleep on it, and then they try again. Yeah, that was not premeditated, but it did feel, it felt cathartic writing it. And I think as a mother now, one of the things I was constantly asking myself in writing this book is like, how much do you tell your children and when? Because there is such a thing, of course, as burdening them with your secrets, or oversharing, or telling them things that are not age appropriate, or, etc. Like, all of that. I don't want people to finish this novel and think like, okay, so all the truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God, I'm going to tell my 8-year-old, my whole, like, that's not what I'm trying to say is the way forward here. It's more just that the Jungian concept of unlived lives, and that like there is a burden that children live with, which is the mistakes of their parents, or the thwarted potential of their parents, or the things in the parents' lives that were never properly expressed or exercised, or all of that baggage or heritage does get passed along. And if at the right age the parent can give the child the key to some of that, it may speed up their ability to have greater freedom to make their own choices. Because those grooves, those kind of patterns, those all of the things that we do to avoid feeling the things we don't want to feel as adults can be passed on to the kids. And sometimes in the form of a fear, sometimes in the form of a prejudice, sometimes in the form of a default behavior, like people pleasing, and I think the work that Penn is doing to kind of excavate her parents' past lives is meant to sort of free her from all that.
And I also think that there's part of that that helps you put your parents into context too, because your whole life they're your parents, and we never see them as real people. But I also think it's nice to have those conversations because it's like, oh, you're a person. You had experiences, you had bad things and good things and all of that. And that's kind of the age, after your angsty teen years is when you can start to be like, oh, this is a person who has a life. And that's nice to experience too.
It really is. There's a Mark Twain quote that I'm going to butcher, but it's something like, at 17, I couldn't believe how little my father knew. And, when I turned 21, it was astonishing how much he learned in only 4 years. But that, that is part of the life cycle, that at physical maturity, human children do tend to view their parents as having made a hash of their lives. Like there is a kind of creative destruction, I think, that can take place at that age. And it doesn't always, of course, and some of it is cultural. And I think the whole like teenage rock and roll, 60s, 70s cultural hair, like that all plays into it. And maybe some of it is manufactured, but I do think some of it is just evolutionary, that you reach and you have enough maturity, enough intellectual maturity at that age to start questioning, but not enough perspective to empathize fully with what they were up against.
Both Alice and Penn have some not great sexual experiences, very sadly, that are far too relatable for women. I'm glad you included them because I think it is a very regular thing, unfortunately, for women to experience. But I'm just curious to know why you wanted to include them and have their characters go through that.
So we've been talking a lot about kind of physical versus emotional maturity. And I think one of the most obvious ways in which we experience the discrepancy is in our sex lives. And the expectation of early, sexual experience, at least for my generation, I just remember this strong sense of sort of pressure to kind of almost emulate intimacy before you really knew what that was.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think there is in Alice's development a boldness that comes from, she is very aware of power dynamics, and she learns early that she wields a certain amount of power based on the way she physically shows up in the world. And she decides early, because of her desire to have a career as an actor, that really works in her favor, and she wants to exploit that. And I think she, over the course of the novel, learns that the trust that she's been placing in, it's not really trust, because she has, even before what happens in the novel, she's experienced people who don't have her best interests at heart, is a mild way of putting it. But I think she has this sense of almost invincibility and this sense of ownership over her own body and her own physicality, that she's not afraid to try things. She sees it as her prerogative. She sees it as an important part of her independence, to kind of experience her freedom physically, like with her whole body and soul. I wanted to illustrate how precarious it can be to be a woman of that age, and that it's not necessarily about pointing fingers, because I think all of the characters in this novel are doing their best, and I don't actually think anyone is evil. But I do think that there are crossed wires, there are misunderstood signals, there are insecurities that play out in ugly ways. This is the stuff of life. And when I go back to the kind of sea creature metaphor, this very fragile, doesn't have an exoskeleton type of creature that is brave and that is fighting these battles, does sometimes encounter a shark. Like that's, and has to get creative in terms of how to handle that.
During a conversation Penn has with her mother regarding motherhood, Anna says, "The only way is to make peace with yourself." And I thought that was so lovely and probably a really hard thing. And have you made peace with yourself as a working mom?
Wow,
Where
what
did
a
that
good
come
question.
from?
What a good question. I would say that's an uphill kind of daily, it's a daily practice more than a one and done type of situation. I would say that when I'm least at peace with myself is when I am the least capable as a mother. When my fuse is shortest and when I end up saying things that I later replay in my head and I'm like, well, that was just nuts. And it's usually, negative self-talk, as they call it, does affect like that will filter into the ecosystem. And that like one of the worst things that I can do for my kids is be mean to myself because they will feel that. And I've
Right.
seen them feel that. So yeah, I'd say that I really do believe that in real life and that I'm trying hard to make peace with myself.
Christina and Penn are chatting at one point, and Christina says about life that getting to choose for oneself is a gift so vanishingly rare that one must never squander it. This is such an amazing reminder to not to take life for granted, and we all have choices to make, and at some point we get to choose for ourselves, and we need to remember how special that is. And I loved that you put that in there. And it was just like kind of like a go forth message in the book almost.
I love that you've picked up on really some of my favorite bits, Allyson. Thanks.
You. It was like your book spoke to me.
Oh.
Yeah, I just think that's the message everybody should take is remember when you get to make your own choices. And that's lovely.
And that sometimes you'll make the wrong one and that's okay. You just acknowledge it and try to course correct.
I just have a couple more questions, but before I switch a little bit, is there anything we didn't talk about your book that you want people to take away from?
Well, we haven't talked about Fergus.
Well, I know that's true. I found him very endearing because I found from him what Penn found, where I was like, I think he's a good guy. I think he has really good intentions. I liked him.
Yeah, I think there are some characters in this book who are misunderstood uh, because they haven't. I think one of the major themes in this novel is like that we're not all given the tools to express who we really are, and that can cause some of us to come off in a certain way. And that's not fair, right? So the quote at the very beginning about the monster, it's not referring to one character. It's referring to all of us because I think there's kind of a protagonist and an antagonist inside of all of us. And yeah, I think some of the characters that I'm like most attached to are not necessarily the ones that come off the best. But that's how life can be. And I think I don't know why I felt the need to bring up Fergus. He was the first character to kind of walk into my mind. And so even though he's far from being the main character, he is for me, he was like the entryway into this whole story. So I
Oh,
appreciate him.
interesting. How was he the entryway?
He just started talking in my mind. And I
Mhm.
was like, who are you and why are you heckling some person called Penn? And that like bits of dialogue just sort of started floating through my brain. And I was in the forest in Canada. I was in Algonquin Park, and I hadn't been in Edinburgh in almost a decade, and it didn't really make sense that this kind of melancholy Englishman was talking in my brain, but he was. And yeah, he opened up the whole world for me. I don't know that his story is fully told in these pages.
Yeah.
But for me, he's an interesting figure.
It's good that you're a writer and that you just wrote when you heard voices because other people. Just kidding.
I didn't tell people that I was hearing voices.
I'm in the
I
forest
know.
hearing voices. I'm going to go write a book. Well, we do work for a bookstore, of course, so I have to ask, do you have any either all-time favorite books or some recent favorite books that you've read?
Well, I just read Orbital,
Mhm.
which won the Booker Prize, and I see why. That was heavenly and really brought me out of the here and now. It's set on the International Space Station, and it is just a beautiful meditation on life on Earth. In terms of favorite books, I love Elena Ferrante. Like everybody else in the world, I think. Yeah. I think I really admire storytellers who are able to share parts of humanity that are difficult to confront. And I think the Neapolitan novels, but also Days of Abandonment and some, Elena Ferrante's work explores the aspects of motherhood that are not all a bed of roses. And I think that, and Doris Lessing has done that. And, Ashley Audrain, an amazing Toronto novelist, has done that. And I just think that I love seeing that, like Jessamine Chan with The School for Good Mother. Like, it's becoming something that we can talk about. And I appreciate that as a mother and as a human and as a daughter. I just think that's a very healthy thing to be doing.
I like it. Have you ever read The Red Tent by Anita Diamant?
No.
Right, you should put that on your list. That's my all-time favorite book. I've read it a few times. I love that book.
I'm writing this down. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, maybe you're welcome. I hope you like it. Well, Emma, thank you so much. This has been so wonderful. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. Congratulations on your book coming out. I can't wait for everybody to read it. There it is.
Allyson, I'm so happy that we got to chat, and it was so lovely to see you again. Thank you for your very insightful questions.
Oh, thank you so much. All right. Bye, everybody. See you later.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.